make sure you know about that. So now we're ready for our featured speaker, and I'm very excited to talk about GT. First off, he is the co-founder of Strong Towns Oceanside. Strong Towns is now an international movement, and it was touched off by a book that was published in 2019. It's called Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. And it's about smart growth principles against unchecked urban sprawl. And that is the key to having a sustainable future. Strong Towns also advocates for transparent municipal budgets and for road design that focuses on pedestrian and bicycle safety over motor vehicle dominance. That's how to create walkable, vibrant communities. And our speaker, GT, holds an MS in Applied Economics from Johns Hopkins University with a focus on children's public health in the developing world. He also holds a certificate in wildlife management from the School for Field Studies in Kenya and a certificate in project management from Duke University. He is a children's health professional with over 15 years of experience working with governments of several countries in Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Europe in the pediatric public health space. As a volunteer with local nonprofits, environmental nonprofits, Preserve Calavera and Friends of El Corazon, GT works on native plant restoration, invasive plant removal, and preserving Oceanside's wildlife corridor. So please welcome GT.
Thank you very much, Barb, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for joining this evening. I really appreciate you taking time this evening to learn about Strong Towns. And I hope, let me share my screen. And I hope what we get out of this meeting, there's a lot to cover tonight. And I do apologize for the amount of content, but I hope that by the end of this meeting, you understand I have a few goals for this meeting. So let me just say those two goals first. One, I hope that after you've heard this content, you really understand the why of what Strong Towns and other urbanist groups are doing rather than the what, but the reason why when it comes to good city design, and also that you learn with me, how we decipher this formula of what makes cities wonderful, thriving places to live. So let me just show you this is kind of like a cartoon that's sort of like going to show you sort of what we're going to be talking about today is just essentially rolling back decades of mistakes where we put large highways through cities, and now we're sort of going backwards and making our cities more pedestrian and bike friendly, and we're planting trees and making roads narrower. And now we're just that's sort of like the overview for tonight, but it's going to start to get into a lot of details. But as it gets really into the weeds, I hope that you just keep this this cartoon kind of in mind. So moving forward, there's a few terminology. I have a lot here. I'm not going to go through every single one. So I'm going to spell out when there's an acronym or an initialism, I'm going to spell them out for you. So I'm not going to say too much lingo, but I do want to highlight one word that we will use a lot tonight is called urbanism, which sounds like, it just relates to cities, but it's really a global movement about the science of building functional, prosperous, and resilient cities. When we talk about urbanism, that's sort of what we're talking about today. So I want to begin with the biggest change between how cities used to be developed and how they're developed today. So with the way they used to be developed, what we call traditional development. So from about the oldest cities that we know in history, say like Jericho or Damascus in Syria, these are cities that have been inhabited since 9000 BC. So roughly 11,000 years of human history, cities were all essentially the same. They evolved naturally based on the needs of the residents. They had a defined central nexus of commerce, socialization, and habitation. So like having a town square, public plaza, an old town, or some place where people would congregate where there is a variety of things to do: eating, drinking, socializing, seeing your friends, etc. And in these traditional cities, there's no zoning, there's no general plan, there's no strict rules and regulations, because the city builds itself as needed and changes as needs are change over time. And third places, this is a term you'll hear a lot. Third place is really the place where you congregate. So your first place is where you live, second place where you work, and the third place is where you do everything else. You socialize and you spend time with your peers. And those third places, they abound in traditional cities because, again, the residents are the ones who design the city, and that's what people really want in their city. And then housing, right now we talk about housing crisis, housing so expensive. But in traditional city development, there's no such thing as a housing crisis, because housing isn't limited. It's not restricted. Housing is built as needed. It changes over time. It can be incrementally developed from large to small and change based on the needs of the population. And cities thrive because, again, they're designed by the residents, and they evolve over time by need by the residents. And so when something is no longer needed, it gets torn down and something is built on top of it that is needed. And like I said, no strict rules or regulations are needed on what can't be built, because it's built based on the needs of the residents. And so I'll give you an example. This is the second, or tied for the first oldest city in the world. This is Damascus, Syria. So it's been inhabited for 11,000 years. And this is what it looks like if you visit it today. And so just kind of take a look at what you see. I'm not going to tell you what you're seeing, but I want you to take a look at what it looks like in downtown Damascus, Syria today. And this is what Jerusalem looks like today, which has been inhabited for 5,000 years, since 3000 BC. So take a look at downtown Jerusalem. Or how about Venice, Italy, which was founded in 421 AD, and take a look at the public plaza here in Venice. You can see that residences on the second, third, fourth, and fifth floor, and on the bottom floor is commercial, and that the plaza is car-free. The plaza is for people, and that vendors are allowed to set up shop, and restaurants are able to push their way out into the plaza to expand outdoor dining. And then from a bird's eye view, I want to show you Barcelona, Spain, which from a bird's eye view, it might look like New York City. It may look, so it may look, from some people might say it looks very ugly, very hellscapish, very urban. These are called the super blocks in Barcelona, and they're not built by code. They've built over time, and each block is slightly different. If you look very closely, they're actually not the same thing. And from a street view, this is what it looks like in the super blocks of Barcelona today. So they have limited car use in several of the super blocks. And so from a street view, as a pedestrian, it's not ugly at all, right? So it's very different than what it looks like from above. So it really is a city that's designed for people. And this is Santa Barbara, California today. This is what State Street looks like in Santa Barbara, because they've closed off at least 6 blocks to cars. And you can go there today and you can experience a car-free downtown in Santa Barbara right now. So that's traditional development, and that's how everything was done for about 11,000 years. And now how do we design cities today? So it wasn't really until 1946 that we completely changed the way that we built cities. We started basing them upon the automobile, and we started basing them on planned communities that was being built by an outside developer, not residents. So a large development would be built, and then a developer would pitch it, and they would have to sell it like a good. They would say, come live in this big community that we've built. And so projects are really big. They're not incremental. They're not made by residents, but they're these large projects. And once they're completed, they're considered finished. And like I said, in traditional development, that word doesn't make any sense. It's never finished. It's never final. It's always changing. But today's cities, once you build something, it can't be anything else. Once it's residential, it has to be residential. Once it's commercial, it has to be commercial, and there's no in between. And so these had to be sold, right? You had to sell this product. So propaganda was used to sell suburbs. This was a good. And to sell them, developers would say, you want to live not in a crowded city. It's very smelly and ugly, and it's full of people and it's crowded. So you need to live outside the city. You need to get far away from the city. And so they sold suburbs as a good, as something to get out of the city. And then to make it even worse, automobile companies paid cities like Cincinnati, Detroit, Boston to rip out the trolley lines they had in their downtowns and to defund train travel so that you would have to take a car. And so cities, they bought into that because people started moving out of the downtowns. They started essentially leveling entire inner city neighborhoods to make way for large roadways, which we call segregation by design, which is where poor people's neighborhoods were now bisected by large motorways. And there was a lot of racist housing policies. If you weren't wealthy enough to move into the suburbs, you were stuck in the inner city. And guess what? The inner city was now not a beautiful place to live, like I just showed you. It's now quite the opposite. And so single family detached homes were this product, and then cities passed exclusionary zoning to make them almost like what I'm going to call maybe provocatively, almost like a country club, in the sense that you cannot come here, you cannot move here, and you cannot build here. It's a finished community and it's going to be this price, and you're not allowed. And so when that happened, cities, they bought into this, but it's pretty much the way that cities ended up dying, really. It's because cities gave up their most precious asset, which is land, and they gave it up for the lowest return possible, which is single family detached homes. That gives cities the lowest return pretty much of anything. So the city essentially gets back very little property tax, but now has this very dangerous cycle of insolvency because there's heavy infrastructure costs involved with building these large suburbs outside the city center. And we're going to touch that into more detail later. And so municipal governments, what they ended up doing is they saw their wealthy citizens moving out to the suburbs. So they invested in the suburbs and they essentially let downtowns go to ruin. So think about like Detroit a few years ago. You would never want to spend time in downtown Detroit because it was in shambles. And now you can see, if you've been to Detroit recently, it's having a renaissance. There actually is a Strong Towns Detroit, and they were just on their local news yesterday. So here are some examples of that propaganda. Come live in the suburbs. You've got your own home. You can build your own garden. There's sunshine, essentially saying that the city somehow does not have homes, gardens, or sunshine, which of course we know is completely not true. And like I said, it's a very racist policy. Look at these billboards. There's a white family in a car, things that not most people could afford in the 40s and 50s. And then you have poor Black people in the inner city that are waiting for something. And this type of propaganda was all over the United States in the 40s and 50s. And so, for example, here's some more kind of like racist propaganda, and it's in the 50s. Like I said, poor Black people have to remain in the inner city, investment halted, but richer white people are now in the suburbs, and investments and roads especially boomed, but so did infrastructure costs, because now cities are on the hook for paying for something they never had to pay for before, which is single family homes that are outside the city center. So this was something new for cities. They never were really designed to withstand these infrastructure costs. And as the last piece of propaganda I'll show you, where it says things money can't buy. And I'll point the arrow to what's clearly a factory with smokestacks. And so when cities started zoning for the first time, they say, this is a single family zone, this is a commercial zone. You'll find that they would start zoning things like heavy industrial near poor neighborhoods where people were, disenfranchised. And so those people had poor health outcomes as well, because they're breathing polluted air. And then here we go. Here's another, all white family in the suburbs with a white picket fence who is apparently breathing very healthy air. So this is what Oceanside looks like from Google Earth. And you can kind of see that we've essentially built out almost every parcel of land with single family homes. And the problem with that is that, let's say Oceanside has a big attraction. I think we all probably agree it's our downtown or it's our beach, but no one lives near downtown or the beach. They're living out here, or they're living even further away in Vista or San Marcos, Escondido, or some people come to Oceanside from much further away, Temecula, Menifee, Marietta. I even talked to my the nurse that I saw yesterday at my doctor's appointment. I asked where she was from. She commutes every day from Marietta. So she has an hour-and-a-half commute every single day to come work in Oceanside. So that's how many vehicle miles traveled she has just to come to Oceanside. Another big problem with having everybody out in the suburbs and letting your downtown sort of go to ruin is that if everybody wants to come to the downtown, but they have to drive now to get there instead of just living in downtown, now they have to drive. Cities ended up essentially just bulldozing things for parking lots. There's something they never really needed before, because the city was the city. The city had the things that make a city amazing, but now it can't be amazing and it can't be beautiful because now it has to be parking lots. And this is what Oceanside looked like just a few years ago. You can see the most prime real estate in Oceanside is parking lots. And so I want to give an example, say, of Cincinnati. This is what Cincinnati looked like in 1955 in the top left corner, which is, a functioning city with density and multi-use. And you can see what it looked like on Street View. And it looks very similar to Damascus and Jerusalem. And there's actually a trolley line in the middle of that street you can barely see. In 2016, you can see that half the downtown has been bulldozed for these giant freeways. There's these high-speed interchanges that are built right on top of what used to be neighborhoods. And this is what that exact same place looks like in Cincinnati today. It's just asphalt. The city is, destroyed itself to cater to cars and the automobiles. And we wouldn't have to do that if we didn't have suburban development. So now, instead of people going to downtown to actually enjoy it, what do we have? We're playing Frogger every time we go to downtown. We're trying not to get hit by a car. So anybody's ever played that game? You have the little frog and you try not to get splat by a car in the middle of the road. So that's what our downtown is now. It's not safe, it's not fun, and it's for cars, not for people. And so when you get into strong towns, which I'll get into in a second, they'll really get into the nitty gritty of not just how suburbs kind of ruin cities. I think that's not overstatement, but if you don't agree with me there, how about this? Suburbs actually turn out to be a scam. And I'll go into detail here. What happens is that when developers pitch these really large single family zone neighborhoods, they're saying this is going to pay for itself, right? You're going to get all this property tax. So go ahead and approve this project. And of course, cities like Oceanside did that in mass in the 60s, 70s, and 80s until pretty much every parcel was filled up. However, the city didn't really understand that they're financially responsible for a colossal amount of infrastructure. So new roads, new sewer lines, storm drains, utilities, water mains, et cetera, where the long-term maintenance cost was not accounted for. And in the short term, yeah, it looks like the city gained property tax. It seemed like they're doing really well. But actually in the long term, it turns out that maintenance costs outpace the property tax that was gained, and that starts this cycle of insolvency. And because they do not have enough money to pay for these maintenance costs, what you'll find is cities end up deferring maintenance costs, and they continually have to increase the maintenance budget so that every resident is now paying for suburban neighborhood upkeep. So even if you live in the inner city, you're paying for all of that suburban maintenance costs. You may find that cities like Oceanside, and not picking on Oceanside, because this is a problem across the United States and Canada especially, that city budgets will seem balanced when you go through them and read them. They're balanced though because they cut lots of programs. So yes, they're balanced, but not really. They're just cutting programs. So we have bad roads, we have potholes, and then to make up for that, the cities, not just Oceanside, but all of our peers are passing equivalents of Measure X to make up for the difference. So why Strong Towns is becoming so popular in North America, especially US and Canada, is because it actually turns out that what I'm describing to you is almost uniquely a US and Canada problem. Almost no other country in the world is currently having this same type of housing problem. So just to put in perspective, in 1916, 98% of travel in the US was through railroads. But by 1956, so that's just 10 years after the first suburban neighborhood was pitched, it dropped to 4%. Essentially, in 40 years, we completely switched from being railroad centric to automobile centric. And today, this is how much we spend on trains for Amtrak, which is US government owned. 2.3 billion for Amtrak, 64.3 billion for federal highways. Now, the largest study done on walkability of cities was published this year. It was in The Economist. It's behind a paywall, so I'm just presenting it to you here because the paywall is obnoxious. So in these triangle diagrams, it essentially asks people from every city. Each dot is not a person, each dot is a city. So for Europe, for example, that really big gray dot over there, that's London, and the next largest dot is Paris. So every dot here is a city, and it's based on hundreds and hundreds of survey points where they ask people, how do you get to work? Do you take public transit? It says bus. That's wrong. It's actually any type of public transit. So metro, train, whatever. So did you take transit? Did you walk or bike? That's the yellow. That's the active transportation. So if you took an e-bike or a scooter, you're on the yellow. Or did you drive? And that's red. So if you look at Europe, you can kind of see it's kind of scattered all over the place. But little cities especially, they really do walk and bike to work. And for really big cities like London, there's more public transit use. They have a really great underground system. But what about, everybody knows Europe is great. Okay, well, what about East Asia and Pacific? Well, it's also it's variable, but it's not car-centric either. In fact, it skews actually more towards public transit in Europe, in East Asia and Pacific, and less on the active scale. So what about Latin America, the Caribbean? So this is a smaller diagram, but it has cities like Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, and it's pretty much right in the center between sometimes I walk and bike, sometimes I take transit, and sometimes I take my car. And now I want you to look at North America. There's no variety. The only thing that's even remotely off the very bottom corner is that big circle, which is New York City, because they have a great metro system. Everywhere else, it's 100% car. So we're outliers in the world. So now I've given you a lot of history, I want to just jump into what Strong Towns is. So Strong Towns is just one of many urbanist groups in North America that, promotes what I was talking about, traditional development versus suburban sprawl. It was started in 2011 by a man named Charles Marone, who is a land use planner and civil engineer in Minnesota. And then it recently expanded in just the past 3 years, what we call local conversations, which are kind of like our version of chapters. And now there's over 200 local conversations in the US and Canada. One thing that the local conversations do, like Strong Towns Oceanside, is we really want residents to feel like they can improve their own city rather than just moving away and say, my city is incapable of solving this issue. It's not a good city to live in. And so I'm just going to move away. And Strong Towns has had a massive growth in social media presence since 2023, but that actually every urbanist content creator has in the past year just blown up. So it's not just Strong Towns. There are 3 books that Strong Towns has. I'm not trying to pitch them to you at some book club, but they are easy to read. They're short. They're not too technical. The first one is really about what I said at the beginning, traditional versus suburban sprawl. The second one is really about transportation, and making safe roads. And the third one, which just came out this year, is all about housing. It's all about the housing crisis. But in terms of urbanism itself, there's probably 3 other books that are a little bit more well-known that you may have heard of. They're actually a little bit harder to read, in my opinion. Like High Cost of Free Parking is way more dense. And then Jeff Speck's Walkable City is probably the best of all those books, in my opinion. And then there's another classic, which is called Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. I'm not going to go into every Strong Towns core idea. We'll be here forever, but I'll just say, and I think Barb already mentioned this, the big core ideas, or I should say like the campaigns that Strong Towns is after right now, is transparent local accounting, safe and productive streets, end parking subsidies and mandates, end highway expansion, and incremental housing. And if you don't know those are, that's fine, because we're gonna talk all about that. So what is Strong Towns Oceanside? So that's our local conversation. We started in October 2023, and it was founded by 3 residents. I believe they're on the call tonight. One of them is Thomas LaCroix, who's born and raised here in Oceanside. The other is Anthony Tellis, who's born and raised in Oceanside. And the other is a transplant. That's me. And then we have about 15 active members in our group. And I do have shout out, Eric is on the call tonight, so I do want to shout out to our council member, Eric Joyce, is kind of a spinoff of his environmental advisory group, where we talk a lot about the environment, which is great, but it always seemed that we're talking about the housing crisis. Even though, you know, we're talking about the environment, it always ended up being a discussion about the housing crisis. And Thomas LaCroix and I kind of met after the meeting, and he said, wow, that's like, we really need something that's not just environmental group in Oceanside. We really need something that's about urbanism. So that's how this started. We meet twice a month, every other Thursday at Bottlecraft in Oceanside on Tremont Street for pretty much 3 hours almost every time. We just talk about whatever. And now we're going to be putting our background work publicly on Discord so that people can jump in and work with us on our projects. So you don't have to go to social hour. You don't have to do anything. You can do it from the comfort of your home. And the projects we've been working on, we just finished a lot of comments on Oceanside's general plan update, phase 2, the Coast Highway redesign project. Some of you may know is this project that's been in Project Limbo since 2009 about putting in roundabouts and a road diet on the Coast Highway north of Oceanside Boulevard. We talk about maybe having a car-free zone in downtown, but that hasn't really gotten off the ground yet. And then we want to do a bench building workshop, which we're working on the logistics for that. And then lastly, I'll just say that we do support kind of our sister local conversations. We help support the one that just started in Poway and Rancho Bernardo. And I keep trying to push people to certain people who shall remain nameless. I'm trying to get them to start one in Temecula and Vista. I got the one in Orange County to kind of start up one on Instagram. So I'm trying to get everybody kind of involved. And then our co-founder, Thomas LaCroix, just started a chapter of YIMBY, which we'll talk about what that is later. So if you don't know what YIMBY is, I will go into that in more detail. And I did put not just bikes in the corner there because that is actually kind of the gateway that I highly recommend that everybody see on YouTube. If you want to learn all about urbanism and you want to learn it from someone who's a lot better than I am at explaining it, I recommend Not Just Bikes, which is a one guy. So I put it here as an urbanist group. That's not true. It's just one person who used to live in a suburb of a city called London in Ontario, Canada. Which is not a nice place to live. And now he lives in Amsterdam. And pretty much all of his videos are about why it wasn't really great to live in London, Ontario, Canada, and why it is so great to live in Amsterdam, and goes into the details about that. So I wanted to create this kind of Venn diagram to show where our groups overlap with environmental groups like yours, like Sierra Club. So on the left, this is obviously not every environmental group. These are just the ones that I've been a part of or been volunteers with. So Buena Vista Audubon Society, Surfrider, Preserve Calavera. And then on the right, here's some examples of some urbanist groups around the United States, like American Planning Institute, the Congress for New Urbanism, et cetera. But we all really do want the same thing, maybe for different reasons. Maybe environmental groups say they want to save the planet, and maybe urbanist groups say, well, we want to save cities. Okay, but we all want the same thing. We want less VMTs, which is vehicle miles traveled. We want cars to be driving fewer miles. We want less greenhouse gases, GHGs. We want less air pollution in our atmosphere. We want less car dependency. We want to increase in public transit, and we want that thing, that big thing, TDM, transportation demand management. We want our cities to get serious about having a plan for how they're going to invest in transit and alternative ways of getting from point A to point B that doesn't involve getting in your car. So we're kind of on the same team. And now I put in this Venn diagram, it looks like we're kind of equally weighted, but that's not true. In Oceanside, we just have strong towns, and then starting tomorrow is the very first meeting for YIMBY. And I'll say what that is in a second. So we're still very outnumbered, but we saw kind of a vacuum in the need for an urbanist group in Oceanside. So my background is child safety, child therapeutics, and pediatric therapeutics. So why am I interested in this? Well, I mean, it's funny to work really hard at making medicine safe for children, but then we read in the news that the #1 killer of children is, for example, firearms, followed by cars. So it makes you feel kind of helpless. We work really hard on making medicine safe for children, but that doesn't really matter if the #1 killer of children is firearms and cars. So this got me really interested in safer streets and, of course, safe routes to school. But what about car drivers? And when you hear about trying to reduce car centricity, car dependency, you might say, well, car drivers actually want the same thing as urbanist groups. If you're driving a car, what's the thing you hate most? Traffic. You hate other drivers. So car drivers also want fewer cars on the road, and they also want less traffic. So we should be on the same team. And then it actually turns out that AARP is on the same team as urbanist groups, not just on the same team, but almost exactly the same. AARP has a whole campaign called Age-Friendly Cities. And you might have seen that Oceanside just signed up to be an age-friendly city. What does that mean? I guess we're going to find out, but we all want the same thing: be able to go places without having to jump in a car, being able to have pedestrian and mobility device access, safe streets, and be able to take public transit when we can and not have to drive. So same team as AARP. So now this is my more provocative slide. If this upsets you, I apologize, and we can talk about in the Q&A session, but this is pretty much where we don't overlap, because urbanist groups, we really do think of housing as a necessity. We really want a lot of housing. We think the housing shortage is artificial. And we really do believe that abundance translates to affordability, and that we want our cities to be inclusive. We want them to build community. We want more housing to be built, and we want a relaxation on the rules and regulations that don't allow us to build housing. And this group could be called YIMBYs, or yes in my backyard. Yes, please build something in my backyard. If my neighbor wants to put in a duplex, if my neighbor wants to add an ADU, if he wants to transform it, that's great. And so in urbanist groups, we say, if you're the property owner, you should do what you want to fulfill the community's needs. If you want to change it into, say, a neighborhood bodega and sell groceries, that would be great too, because right now I have to drive 15 minutes to get to my closest grocery store. And then our quote arch enemies, which is not true, but I'll just say it to be provocative, are NIMBYs, which is not in my backyard. And this is a group that's more well-known, and this is kind of the group that will show up to city council pretty much every time there's a new development, which is saying, I don't want it to be built. I don't want it in my backyard. I don't want to look at it. I think it's very ugly. But that all comes from a totally different mindset from urbanist groups, because in that mindset, they're really thinking the city as their own community. Like, it's at capacity. We don't need anybody else. We make the rules and you're not allowed. So in that group, housing is treated not as a necessity, but is treated as an investment product. That means that it's in their best interest to not build any more housing, because the scarcity of housing equates to a high value. So it's not about housing, it's about investing. And that thrives on exclusivity. That means that the more exclusive it is, the more expensive it is. And so when we try to build new housing projects, you'll see that people come out en masse and say, this is a terrible project, it's going to ruin the neighborhood. But I would argue that's just code speak for it might lower the resale value on my home. Let's see, part of the slide didn't load anyway. Not sure why I did that. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure why I did that. So why change our cities to begin with? So like I said from the beginning, is our cities used to be dynamic, but now they're static and they're built to a finished state. That's something that was never done prior to 1946. And though we need to change things in our cities, like we don't want that empty lot to be, an out of business Walmart. We would love it to be something else. We can't, because of so many rules and regulations. We're not allowed to evolve or let our city change over time. So the current trajectory, and where I think Sierra Club might be interested, is that we think that current city development is an unsustainable way of developing, which is when you want to build new housing, where do you look? You clear cut habitat, you go as far away as you can from the city center, and you bulldoze it and you make something like North River Farms, for example. And it just continues the same problem of car dependent design. Though now there's this kind of thing thrown in with EVs, which I will kind of get into more detail, which is kind of a red herring because EVs don't actually help with car dependency. They don't help with traffic, road wear. They don't do anything except for reduce greenhouse gases. So it's a red herring in the sense that it's not actually getting to the core of the problem with bad city design. It's just diverting it over and thinking that we can solve it by buying expensive cars. We have freeway widening projects still today, even though we know they don't work through what's called induced demand. So every time you widen a freeway, eventually that freeway will reach capacity again and starting this cycle that's unsustainable. They don't actually alleviate traffic. And you can see that the 5 was expanded, what's called is called the North Coast Corridor. The NCC, that was the largest expansion I've ever seen of the 5. They even expanded it over wetlands and lagoons, even though Caltrans now on their own website will tell you that induced demand is real and that freeway widening doesn't work. And today we have, believe it or not, we have the highest level of pedestrian deaths that we've had in 40 years. So it's not like it's still a problem. It's actually a worse problem now than it's been in 40 years. And with this type of development, we have destroyed traditional childhood elements like playing outside, biking in groups without supervision, walking to school, biking to the corner store. All of that is now gone thanks to this car-centric development. So I want to say a few things. This is an one of the first pages in Oceanside's budget is that the median home value in Oceanside is $712,000, but the median household income is $86,000. Now, if you plug that into a calculator, it means that in order to buy a house in Oceanside, you need to make 1.8 times the median household income. In other words, you cannot afford to live here. And then in terms of time to travel to work, only 83% are commuting outside the city. So that means, 83% are commuting outside the city. Only 17% of people have a 15-minute travel time to work or less. So that means most people are leaving Oceanside to get to work. And in terms of how they got there, 77% drove alone. So that means only 23% did something else. They carpooled, they took transit, they biked, or they walked. So it is a car-dependent city, but it's also an affordable place for its own residents. So how does this approach help the environment? So in Strong Towns and other urbanist groups, we really do want to focus on revitalizing the urban core of cities versus and infill developments versus clear-cutting habitats for these large suburban sprawl projects. That would reduce the need for freeways to connect people from further away to their city centers. And the more we build freeways, the more we bisect habitat, and then we need these very expensive wildlife corridors. We do think that as you build functional cities, you end up building better habitat because you have a real city in the center, and then you are allowed to have green space on the periphery, and you're not encroaching on habitat. And like I said earlier, we want fewer vehicle miles traveled. We want better transit. We want less air pollution. We even want more shade trees because it turns out that putting in shade trees is a natural traffic calming measure. So even though some people may want shade trees for lowering the temperature in a city, we also would like it to slow down cars, and also because it makes it more enjoyable to be in the city when you're not being pounded by the sun. And again, like I said, we want to refocus on good city design versus saying if we are able to switch everybody to EVs, magically all of our problems will disappear. So this is from Oceanside's official documents. So for example, where do the greenhouse gases come in Oceanside? Well, 50.6% of them come from driving. And this is what I was talking about for EVs, just to kind of be a little bit controversial. This is what your city looks like with fossil fuel vehicles. But guess what? Now we switch to EVs. Look what it looks like. So we really want the far right one, which is no cars. We would love to see walking, biking, and more transit. And this is another example about what I was talking about earlier of why we think it does help the environment, because if we need to build 100 new dwelling units, if we do suburban sprawl, we can bulldoze, the entire area. But if we're able to build density, then we can actually maintain the majority of the habitat, because we want that green space for people to enjoy. We want the recreation. And we really do believe that's how a community is built, instead of putting everybody in little separate boxes. So how is the city currently broken down right now? Oceanside right now, 36% of it is residential, 16% of it is roads. So that leaves everything else. There's only 11%, or sorry, 21% that's park and open space, because you're right, 36 plus 16 is now destroyed habitat. And you can see right here in more detail that 72% of Oceanside is considered urban or developed or disturbed habitat. And then there's the rest of our actual native types of habitat, like coastal sage scrub. And then you might recognize this. This is the Calavera Preserve in Carlsbad, but you can also see that line that bisects it right in the middle. And you can see that, that could have been double the size, right? But half of it is suburban sprawl, and the other half is what has really become really the only big nature park with nature trails in our Tri-City area. So if that had become suburban sprawl, or I think it was originally going to be a golf course, we wouldn't have any of that recreational area to enjoy for our three cities. So what about wildlife corridors? Something that I've been working on with Preserve Calavera recently. The more that we have suburban sprawl, the more that we have highway widening, the more difficult it is to have a wildlife corridor, because every time we build something, it ends up bisecting open space and bisecting what was a wildlife corridor. So for example, right now we have an issue with California State Road 76, which bisects the open space between Camp Pendleton and Oceanside's 24 nature preserves. And the one I just showed you in Carlsbad, there's supposed to be a north to south wildlife corridor, but it's very difficult because of roads like the 76. This is what Oceanside's wildlife corridor looks like in that black dotted outline. And in the red are these little pinch points that the city has saying, well, these might be problematic. Well, they're problematic because they're roads. And so wildlife is apparently supposed to cross State Road 76, 55-mile-an-hour traffic, Mission Avenue, 45-mile-an-hour traffic, Oceanside Boulevard here is 55 miles an hour, and then Vista Way, 45 miles an hour. So wildlife also has to play Frogger just to get from Camp Pendleton to Carlsbad. Now, you've probably heard of, oh, we can solve this with these wildlife crossings, like the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing, which is being constructed in Agora Hills right now. It's a very cool project. Don't get me wrong. I think it's amazing. But think about this. It's only 200 feet long, and it's cost $92 million. It's also taken 12 years to build, and it has 2 more years until it's completed. That means it costs $460,000 per foot to build that wildlife crossing. So in my opinion, these products are very interesting, but they're unsustainable. They're one of a kind. We're not going to see more of these projects in anytime soon. In order to fix suburban sprawl and highway widening, we would need something like this every few miles. That's never going to happen. And so you may remember that we had the mountain lion in Oceanside. Well, it was, it was very exciting to have one, but it was promptly run over by a car, not surprisingly. So now I want to go into the funding for cities. So I showed you a little bit earlier about when we build suburban sprawl, we have these really inefficient labyrinthine structures of roads, storm drains, sewers, curbs, utilities, et cetera, that serve very few residents. And now we have these really high maintenance costs. But here's kind of the part I really hope that you take away, is that the city budget is dependent on an artificially low number of single family homes. Because remember, we're saying you can't build them. We're all full. Every parcel has been taken up. So there's an artificially low number of homes, but also the tax itself is kept artificially low. We can only increase property tax to a max of 2% each year. So that means that as maintenance costs go increase at market rate, the property tax that the city gets back in terms of revenue is below market rate. Remember, it can only be 2%. And so when parts of our city are no longer working, changing them is nearly impossible due to zoning rules. So I'll give you an example. Every blue thing you see right there, that huge like kind of maze, that's all Oceanside's water pipelines that have to be maintained. And they are like that. They do not, if you look in the town site area in downtown, they follow a grid, they're very efficient. But once you leave the town site area, it's a maze. It follows these single family home neighborhoods. But so does the wastewater collection system. Every purple thing you see, the city has to maintain. So does storm drains, and so do roads, and it piles up. And I want to show you this one graphic. When you buy a house, let's say in 1995, the assessed value you get can only go up 2% each year, and it will never jump until you sell it again. So let's say the property is sold in 2002. Now it can be assessed at 2002 levels, but the value of the home is much higher than that. So like for today, a lot of the houses in Oceanside are well over $1 million in their property value, but the assessed value that the city is getting back in property tax is not $1 million. It's whenever the property was last sold, meaning the longer you've held your home, the lower the effective tax rate is. So just to show you how dependent we are on property taxes, Oceanside gets 56% of its tax revenue from property taxes. And only 18% come from sales taxes, 11% from our Measure X, and 10% from transient occupancy tax or TOT, and that's what hotels and Airbnbs generate. And so when you look at the property tax, I'll just show on the right-hand side that pie chart. When we look at property tax, almost all of it is residential. So we really are reliant on residential property tax to fund the city of Oceanside. And it's like this all around the country. This is not unique to Oceanside. So this may be provocative too, but I feel like a lot of what we hear is a little bit of having your cake and eat it too. We're asking the city, please fix our roads, please maintain utilities, clean up the beach. We want fantastic public pools, we want beautiful public parks, but then we're also saying, do not build new housing, and we will not be getting any 2024 level property tax of that new housing because we're going to be getting the old property tax from the last time all these old houses were last sold. And so to make up the difference, we pass something like a Measure X, which essentially punishes all residents. Now everyone pays the bill for this gap in funding. Now here's some signs that the city might be underfunded. The potholes are all over the city. They're not able to do a full depth reclamation. They're doing cold patching, slurry seals, and the low PCI, which is called Pavement Condition Index. And for those who may not know, Oceanside's Pavement Condition Index is a 56 out of 100. Also, like I said earlier, we may have a balanced budget, but we're cutting funding for programs, cutting funding for after-school programs. We cut funding for our neighborhood traffic calming, and now it's back now, thankfully, because of Measure X. Shuttering public amenities like pools and community centers, having to pass sales tax measures. Another thing that I will say is that when we have pedestrian cyclist fatalities, a lot of times it's in everybody's best interest to say that's a one-off unique accident. It's just an accident. There's nothing that can be done, because the truth is it's actually based on bad city design and dangerous road design. But we don't want to admit that because that will cost a lot of money to fix. And then a lot of deferred maintenance. So not building or not maintaining things and not building the infrastructure that we need, like bike lanes. And in the case of Oceanside, which I've learned from speaking to staff, Oceanside they balance their budget, but they just don't pay their staff very well. They pay them well below the average pay scale for sister cities like Carlsbad and Vista. And then besides making up for missing funding from things like sales tax measures, we're also constantly having our staff have to hunt for grants to make up for missing budget pieces. And so I'll go on to the next thing. So some example, the John Landis Community Center, the after-school programs there and the community center itself have been closed for 14 years straight, and it just reopened, thankfully, for work that, for example, Eric Joyce did. But that was a lot because of community advocacy and because of grants. And really, it should have been a line item in the budget. And the same with the Brook Street Swim Center that needed a lot of renovations, but the city could only foot about 400 something thousand of the money needed. 600,000 came from grants. And in terms of our roads, this is taken from source material, is that Oceanside, as PCI again is pavement condition index, 30% of our roads are in a failing state, 21% are at risk, and then you can see that only 33% are good and 14% are considered excellent. So how does this approach help the municipal budget? Well, we want an increase in property taxes from more housing. We don't want to increase the tax rate. We want there to be more housing units paying into property tax. So we want to increase the revenue and not the rate. And because we want our cities to have a lot of small businesses, street level small businesses, we want our small business to be thriving, and we want the revenue from sales tax to go up, not passing a sales tax measure. We want the revenue to increase. And in terms of when you read about strong towns and urbanists want to reduce parking spaces, well, that's because we want our small businesses to have more retail space, actually more places to make money, because parking spaces do not make money for businesses. And then we'll advocate for things like road diets, because we really do want the city to be maintaining fewer roads. And we love small businesses versus big box stores like Big Lots or Walmart, because it actually turns out when you do the math that small businesses make the city more money per acre. That is, the amount of commerce that's happening is more valuable per acre than a big box store. So we want our small businesses for a variety of reasons. They make our city a lovely place to live, but they actually make us more money than corporate chains. And we want our cities to be cash rich, because cities really don't waste money. Pretty much everything that comes into the city budget, I've read through all these city budgets for Oceanside and our peers, they spend almost every dime that they get. And so if our cities are cash rich, that means that we have more money for public projects, more money for public investment and capital improvement projects. So everyone wins when our city budget is full. Now back to what I was talking about for roads. Oceanside, because of suburban sprawl, we're on the hook to maintain 800 lane miles of road. Now, you may read in something that says Oceanside has 560 miles of road. Okay, that's what's called centerline miles. But lane miles takes into account how wide the road is. So if you have a 3-lane road, that's not 1 mile of road. That's actually 3 lane miles of asphalt that has to be taken care of. So 800 lane miles of road for Oceanside. That's the distance from Oceanside to Albuquerque. And Oceanside, the city, does not actually know the percentage of drivers on our road who are residents versus who are just using the city to get through traffic or outside commuters. That means that we're all paying the cost for road wear and tear for people that may not even live in the city. That means that the traffic in our city that everyone's so focused on is exogenous, meaning it's out of our control. Oceanside has no control over how many people decide to drive through it in every given day. But pedestrians, that's the opposite. That's endogenous. We absolutely have a control over how many pedestrians we have in our city, because we make our streets either safe or we make them dangerous. And just to show you, this is how many miles of road Oceanside put down in 1 decade. In just the 80s, Oceanside put down 552 lane miles of road for suburban sprawl neighborhoods. And now we have 804 lane miles that we have to maintain. Now I want to talk about this term called traffic calming, which is pretty much the opposite of speed limits. Speed limits and stop signs and stop lights, they're all what I would call virtual traffic calming. It's essentially a pretty please asking drivers to please slow down. But traffic calming is different from that. Traffic calming is a physical measure. And right now, almost every road in Oceanside is what we call a strode, which is something that Strongtown sort of coined, which is where a road is neither a street nor a road. A street being a place where commerce happens, and a road being a way to get from point A to point B. But we have combined them in Oceanside and all over North America into something called a strode. And I want to see if I have a photo of one here. Here's College Boulevard in 76. This is a Strode. This is a wide freeway-esque type of 55-mile-an-hour highway, but also you're supposed to be able to get in and out of the Walmart parking lot and the Target parking lot at the same time. And that's why we consider these to be dangerous. And we also would think right now that the way we determine whether roads are successful or not is a little bit backwards. Right now, when we talk about level of service for roads, they'll be giving grades like A through F, but it's actually based on how fast cars can move through them. It's not based on safety. And so we think that needs to change. And so right now there's a global push that's called Vision Zero. And Vision Zero is essentially the idea that cities can do things to drop their pedestrian fatality rate to zero. Examples of traffic calming, these are physical measures of things like roundabouts, putting up bollards, K-rails, curb extensions, which I'll show you in a second, speed bumps, narrowing lanes, or things like rumble strips. So those are examples of traffic calming. And so here's a Strode in Oceanside. Here's another one. This is Mission and El Camino Real. And Oceanside has right now around 11 fatal crashes per year. And in 2021, I believe it was 16. And this obviously only goes to 2022. But for those that follow the news, this year has not been great for Oceanside. And I believe we may already be past 11 and it's August. So I want to talk about why traffic calming works. So for example, it says a New Jersey city. I think that's a weird way to say Hoboken, New Jersey. They implemented traffic calming all over their city, and they have not had a traffic death in 7 years. What you see right there in that picture is something called a curb extension. It's where you physically push the curb out into the road so that pedestrians have a less of a space that they need to cross the road. That's actually a physical way to promote pedestrian safety. And then another thing is called daylighting, which I'll show you in just a second. So this is a form of daylighting that's very cheap. This didn't require anything but paint and some of those little plastic sticky bollards, where it essentially narrows the lane and doesn't allow cars to go and make that turn very quickly where they could hit a pedestrian trying to cross that crosswalk. So this is a photo from a Jersey city. And this is another example of a daylighted intersection in Jersey City. This is what we would call a quick build, where they didn't spend years and years and years to try to get the perfect traffic calming measure and then spend millions of dollars on it. This is just paint, plastic, and a potted plant. You can see they threw a little potted plant in there. So what about affordable housing? That's the thing that we always talk about, no matter what the topic is. It goes back to affordable housing. And urbanist groups would say essentially this, that how can housing simultaneously be both one, an abundant, affordable, obtainable good, and somehow an investment product whose value is dependent on its scarcity? It's not just hedge funds, but individual homeowners too. We're all now treating our homes as investments, not as places to live, but as an investment. And there are myriad state and federal laws that are now trying to push incentives and requirements to build more affordable housing. But the easiest solution is just to increase the supply, especially the supply of what is missing. I'll give you a hint. It's not single family detached homes. It's everything but that. And so because of decades of not keeping up with housing demand, California passed several state housing laws that now require cities to build housing. And that's what we call RHNA numbers, or Regional Housing Needs Assessment numbers. And you can go online right now, and it's publicly available to see every city in California, how many housing units they're required to build at what time and how far along they are at that in that progress. So this was a screenshot. I believe I took this today or yesterday. So between April of 2021 and April of 2029, you can see that Oceanside is required to build 1,268 very low income units, 718 low income units, 883 moderate income units, and 2,500 above moderate income units. And then on the right, it will tell you how close we are to getting to that number. So you'll see that we're, doing pretty well at the moderate income and above moderate, but look at very low and low income units. We are not on track to build those in this time frame. Now, I said earlier, the easiest way to do this is just to build more housing. And so in the Financial Times this year, they posted this graphic that I really like, which shows that of its peer cities in the Midwest, that Minneapolis simply just built more housing from 2017 to now 2024. And what did they get in return, though, is the bottom is the graphic on the right, which is far more interesting. The graphic on the right is changes in median rent. So Minneapolis built more housing. It was the only one to really see a significant drop in rent. Now, I want to talk about something that I think you may find pretty much the most interesting thing about urbanism is that there's an entire ecosystem of housing that is essentially gone because of suburban sprawl. And that is that when cities would build naturally, you would have density in the urban core, and then you would have kind of a modest middle density, and then you would move out to a real suburb like a farm, and you would have a detached single family home. But in the middle here, these are all missing. And why are they missing? It's because they're actually illegal to build because of most zoning restrictions. So instead, you get this very strange juxtaposition of just single family homes right next to mid-rise apartments. And that makes everybody very angry. It's very ugly. It doesn't look natural. And I would agree because we weren't allowed to build anything in between. So those are things like duplexes, fourplexes, cottage courts, and townhomes. So you may have seen recently that Oceanside let the public give them feedback on what's called GPU, General Plan Update. Again, general plans are very complicated. Ideally, you wouldn't even have one because you'd let a city just build naturally. But in this case, Oceanside made it public. It was over 1,000 pages long. And I think I may be one of the few people that actually attempted to read all 1,000 pages. My head was spinning and I almost passed out. But after reading 1,000 pages, I'll tell you there are two major things missing. One is there was no attempt to upzone, rezone, or lift any zoning restrictions at all that would allow for stuff like this. That was not only is it missing middle housing, it was missing from the general plan. The other is that pretty much all 1,000 pages focuses on this thing called smart and sustainable corridors, which is a way to funnel pretty much all new development along three east to west arterial roads, which were Mission Avenue, Oceanside Boulevard, and Vista Way. However, there is a really big problem with that I'll show you in the next slide, and that's that those three corridors are not safe to be on at all. They're actually the high injury roads. They're also the highest noise pollution, the highest air pollution parts of Oceanside. So this is kind of old data, and I asked the city to please update this map because I really like it. It's the subject matter is horrible, but I think it's great to be able to visualize this. Every blue dot you see is a pedestrian collision, and every red little cross there was a pedestrian fatality. And this is from 2000 to 2008. And you can see that, well, not only is Coast Highway probably not very safe, but neither is Mission Avenue, Oceanside Boulevard, and Vista Way, essentially saying, please come to Oceanside and live on those three arterial roads. But by the way, you may not know this, but it's also very dangerous and you're going to have to breathe a lot of exhaust. Here is an updated map. This is not from the city of Oceanside. This is from the National Highway and Traffic Safety Administration. So this is 2008 to 2022. And in this case, it's not just blue dots for collisions. In this data, blue dots are deaths. And you can see again, where are they? They're on those three arterial roads that we're going to be funneling all new development on. And it's also the heaviest air pollution, which I already said. So heaviest noise pollution, heaviest air pollution, heavy traffic fatalities. And then I want to just say a little bit about the rise in homelessness. Whenever we talk about strong towns, someone always asks, what are you going to do about the homeless? But even though it maybe is outside the purview of urbanism, but I think it's important to touch on because, like I said earlier, urbanists really don't want to see housing as an investment product that's limited. They want to see it as an abundant necessity. Having volunteered with homeless shelters in Oceanside, I can tell you that many homeless people are not that stereotypical homeless person. A lot are working class families. A lot of them are students in university. Some of them are just disadvantaged youth. Some of them are just young adults who are just kicked out of their house. And the number one thing that puts them that they have in common is that they just can't afford rent. And like I showed you on the first slides, is that you can't afford to buy a house on the average income in Oceanside. So we are advocating for a variety of housing options, not single family detached homes, which I would argue are the most luxurious of all housing types. You don't have neighbors on your left or right or up or down. So we want tiny homes, granny flats, ADUs, anything that's not single family homes works. Even safe parking lots. That is something that I know we've talked about at City Council. We would love to see more of those because now it transforms something that's really giving nothing to the city into something that's useful. We're letting people have this intermediary space between being homeless and having a home. And like I said earlier, we want our cities to have a lot of funding so that we can have outreach programs, so that we can fund shelters and safe parking lots. So I'm almost done. Thank you for bearing with me. I only have a few more slides. So I will just want to say, how does all of this help me personally? Well, if we follow the Strong Towns method, you will have more chance encounters with your peers because we want to build third places like a town square or a city center where you'll actually see your friends and interact with them. We want more outside recreation because we're going to have safer streets and not having to worry about being run over by a car. We really do want the city and every city to take Vision Zero seriously, which is that it is very much possible, like Hoboken, New Jersey showed you, to just put some paint and plastic on the road and a potted plant for good measure, and you can actually get your fatality rate to zero. We also don't want people to have to be in debt from car payments, car insurance, car maintenance, gas, parking, and toll costs. We want to have our city to be beautiful and walkable. We want our small businesses to thrive. We want there to be foot traffic. We want affordable housing everywhere. And we also, I guess this has resonated with a lot of people, we want our children to be able to live in the same city that we do, because currently that's not possible. So what can you do to improve your city, not just in Oceanside, but anywhere? Well, think about the cheapest and simplest thing you can do, like putting some paint, or like putting up a bollard or a cone to show where a pedestrian crosswalk is. You should find that simple, cheap thing and do that. I would encourage you to start a Strong Towns local conversation or something like that in your community if you don't already have it. And then I think we should be supporting things like zoning reform, lifting zoning restrictions, helping build more missing middle housing, making it easier to build ADUs, and investing in our downtown. And also supporting the things that make our city a wonderful place to live, like the public art, festivals, farmers markets, and then supporting infill developments instead of going out to habitat and bulldozing it, but take a parcel that's degraded or dilapidated and build something useful on it that people really want. And then I'll just put out a term out there called tactical urbanism, which is doing things that may or may not be sanctioned, like painting your own high visibility crosswalk in your neighborhood, or building your own bus stop bench where one is missing. And one thing you can do with your neighborhood group is doing something called a walk audit, which is get your friends together, walk around your community, and highlight the areas that are really not safe. Is it really safe to cross the street here? And if it's not, make that, bring that up to your council member, bring that up to the city. And in Oceanside, at least, and I know also in Vista and Carlsbad, you can submit tickets to the My Oceanside app, or I think it's called Carlsbad Connects, and you can say, hey, there's a crosswalk missing here, or this intersection is dangerous, and then see what the city will do. So that's the end of my presentation. I want to give special thanks to my co-founders, Thomas LaCroix, Anthony Tellis, and then our members we have about 15 members, so we would not be possible with all of your encouragement and support. And so that's the end of my presentation. You can email me strongtownsoceanside@gmail. You find us on Instagram at strongtownsoceanside. And then I'll just leave you with this last thought, is that we can create beautiful cities in North America once again, and you do not have to travel abroad just to experience them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, TT. We do have, it's about 20 after 8. We have some time for some questions, and I see some hands raised already. If you have a question, actually those several people are applauding the presentation. Could you raise your hand either physically or put the hand up in? Sally has a question, it looks like. And you're on mute, Sally.
Sorry, it's 11:30 my time, so I'm on the East Coast. Great presentation, very interesting, a lot to digest. So thank you for covering all that in such a short amount of time. I had one thought and then a question. I'll start with the thought, which was I personally find when we start using language like YIMBYs and NIMBYs, that can be polarizing and maybe mischaracterize people's views on where they stand as it relates to creating more housing. So just a suggestion in a presentation, I'm not sure what that adds to try and say there's one side and there's another side. If that adds any value to the context of what you're presenting, I think it sort of detracts from it because there's so many nuances. And for instance, one nuance that I think is very relevant at the moment, and I live in Encinitas, and we are going through a lot of big development right now that's being pushed forward through zoning rules that are now coming from Sacramento. But what's happening is this development is taking place without any of the things that you're talking about. Like there's no guarantee that we're going to have open space. In fact, some of our open space that has been set aside is now being encroached. There's no infrastructure to go with the development. We're having, in the case of my neighborhood, very large apartment building going up in a very rural neighborhood with a very congested intersection with no traffic mitigation or environmental considerations or any of those things. It's happening all over the city. So I mentioned that in that, how do you deal with the idealistic view of what you're presenting and the reality of where we are today? Because for instance, this new development that's going in will create a very dangerous situation for pedestrians, bike riders, cars, and not just the one in my neighborhood, but all over our area. And so it's a little bit of like, which comes first, how do you deal with the reality of transforming where we are today to get to this place that you guys are envisioning?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard question. So I won't be able to answer it fully, but just your first comment about the YIMBYs versus NIMBYs, like I said in the presentation, it's not something that I necessarily ascribe to, but it is the reality of the situation that those are the terms that are used in this in urbanism. So not that I'm saying it's great to do that, but I think the reality is those are acronyms that are used on a daily basis in this discourse. And there is actually a group that's literally called YIMBY. There's YIMBY Law, YIMBY Action. Those are all real things. So is it polarizing? Probably, and I don't disagree with that, but it is real. So I do think it is worth bringing it up instead of pretending like it's not real. But to your question about the development in Encinitas, so yeah, you probably won't like my answer, but if cities were able to build the things that they need, like for example, Encinitas has a very, very high demand for people to live there, but there's very, very low supply, meaning that, a single family home that is very small square footage in Encinitas is in the $2 million range or more, which, is very expensive. And it's not because the home is a $2 million home, it's because of its location. And so essentially it means that demand has highly stripped out supply. And yes, the city does, or the state does have those RHNA allocations. If cities actually built the housing that's needed, they would not have ever been allocated RHNA numbers. So if a city had actually built the housing naturally over time instead of making it exclusive, they would not even have RHNA numbers because they would have not contributed to the housing crisis. So it's in the opinion of state lawmakers that cities like Encinitas are partially responsible for the housing crisis in California because there is high demand, but they refuse to build. So that's essentially taking it out of the hands of residents, right? Because if it was built naturally, right, every resident could have their say and have a better project than what you have right now, which everybody sounds like is opposed to, and they don't have as much input as they should. So I agree that part is not ideal.
Right. It's less about, there actually are a few good projects, but it's less, yeah, people have their opinions about specific projects, but it's really more about infrastructure and providing, safe streets and things like that that go with the development, which is not happening. I mean, we have a planning commissioner on the meeting. She can always comment, but yeah, it's a big issue.
Could we get maybe two more questions? I saw Diane Nygaard and Heather Conklin had their hands up. And then it's almost 8:30. Diane?
Hi, GT. You mentioned the Oceanside General Plan, which of course is kind of in the forefront right now because that's going to shape the future of Oceanside till 2050. Like, our other city general plans, when we go through an update, it's really a long-term impact. So it's important that we get it right. You called out a couple of big things where the plan was deficient. We're very far into the planning process. Our city is very locked into the idea of smart growth corridors and trying to focus growth in those corridors. But are there things that can be done? You highlighted the safety issues along those corridors. In theory, what we're supposed to have is a transportation system that works for everyone in those corridors, so that in theory, there would be a lot more public transit and bike and pedestrian, all those kinds of things that should mitigate for that. It should supposed to do a whole lot more than mitigate. It's supposed to end up with something better than what we have right now. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, kind of given where we are in this planning framework. Are there a few specific things that would make sense to really focus on for this general plan update that's going to shape us until 2050?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I did speak to our principal planner, Russ Cunningham, after he received my comments. He talked to me directly and essentially said that the wish list for missing middle housing is really pie in the sky at this point. But for smart and sustainable corridors, the comment about them being on a high injury network is something that he was willing to work with us on. So I think that we will just need to keep pushing that those 3 arterial roads need to be transformed from, fast in terms of Oceanside Boulevard, 6 lanes of 55-mile-an-hour traffic. That is not going to be able to be sustainable if there's people living on that road. They cannot walk out the front door to walk their dog and be hit by a car at 55 miles an hour, which is 100% chance of dying. So that, I think having traffic calming on those 3 corridors is really where we would want to push our advocacy work. And that would be my opinion, because there really could be some concessions, and we really actually could make those more livable, walkable places and not be thoroughfares for traffic.
And yeah, a speed limit has to go way down to no more than 35. Maybe also a road diet. We need to have separate bike lanes. I mean, that, for instance, Oceanside Boulevard's a good example. It's wide enough to put in a good bike lane. And also, if we get the urban development along that boulevard that we're looking for and planning for, widening, we have to have sidewalks. We have to have wider sidewalks. We have to have trees. So,
Exactly.
Heather, did you still want to ask a question? Heather Conklin?
Thank you. Actually, I'll go ahead. I see Carl with his hand up, so I'll go ahead and defer to him, but I will follow up
Oh,
GT
yeah.
with you later.
Okay.
Questions. Thank you so much for this.
Sure. Carol?
Well, I guess I have some specific comments on things that can help, and it's along the line of what you were just talking about. As someone who at least attempts to bike a lot of areas and walk a lot of areas, a lot of it is about having several kinds of different infrastructure. So if you're expecting people, a whole range of people to be able to walk or bike, obviously you need to have all those things fairly close, but even then you need to have things like places for people to lock bikes up that are really secure. You go to most grocery stores right now, they don't have bike racks. Some of them have started putting them in, but they're still pretty rare. Mm-hmm. And so the other thing is, we talked about the electric cars, and there's a lot of electric car chargers going in with the electric bikes that are now available. And those are things people who are not very active or physically capable can possibly use. Those, you need to have some charging availability out there for people that don't want to have, a big heavy bike or something like that. So those are some just small little things that can help people make that decision. Okay, instead of jumping in the car, I'm going to go ahead and try something different. But it's still obviously a long way to go to get to that point. And there's going to be transition, like most transitions, that are going to be pretty rough.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment. There are a lot of us in our group do try to bike as much as we can, especially those. I live out in the middle of D3 where it's not very bikeable, but my neighbors do bike. And then my co-founders, Thomas LaCroix and Anthony tell us they live in downtown and they take an e-bike or bike as much as they can. And yeah, they will bring that up to me and say that, yeah, I tried to bike to this venue, but there was nowhere to lock up the bike at all. So I think we need to try to ask small businesses or the city, to install where they are missing, because there are some bike racks around downtown, but not nearly enough. And then when you have a very popular venue, like say right in the middle of downtown or near the beach, where there's going to be a ton of bikes. I've seen some cities do something called like a bike valet, where they will take your bike, for free and just put it in a large area that's locked, and everyone's bike is inside that. So there's no one that can steal it because there's someone that's there full time. So that way you don't have to worry about your bike lock. You don't have to worry about it getting broken into or hit with bolt cutters or whatever, because some people have $1,000, $2,000 bikes and they don't want them to be stolen. And I understand that. So I think something like a bike valet near the beach would be a really cool project to try to advocate for.
Thank you, GT. Well, we're just a little bit over 8:30 at this point, and I want to thank you very much for a fascinating presentation with a lot of very interesting food for thought. And I think the Venn diagram that you had showing the overlap between environmental group interest and the urbanists' interests was fascinating. There's certainly a lot of overlap there, and working together to achieve the kind of growth that we know we need you've done a lot tonight to get that ball rolling.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. And again, thank you for having me present. It was great to speak with all of you. And again, if you do have follow-up questions, you can email me again at strongtownsoceanside@gmail.com, or you can message us on Instagram, strongtownsoceanside. Thank you.
And we can join you where and when? Every other Thursday?
Every
I
other
heard?
Thursday, it's open to the public at Bottlecraft on Tremont Street, where Shoots is. They're combined. We go on the back patio, 6 p.m. every other Thursday. So this Thursday, I believe, no, but the following Thursday, yes, we'll be there. So
Great.
but everybody is welcome. There's no agenda. It's just to kind of meet other people in Oceanside, Carlsbad, and Vista that are interested in this type of these types of discussions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And let's
Give them round of
give a
applause.
virtual.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you all. And thank you for staying late and spending your evening learning about urbanism. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Thanks, GT.
Thank you.
You-
Thanks.
And thank you too, Thomas.